Hello guys, welcome back to the Expensive Coins History channel. There are moments when history hides in plain sight, not in museums, not behind glass, but in the smallest objects we handle without a second thought. A copper coin resting in the palm of your hand, worn smooth by decades of use, passed from one stranger to another, quietly absorbing the story of a nation. This is one of those moments. Imagine Canada in the mid-1960s. A country standing at the edge of transformation, old traditions still holding firm, yet modern change knocking loudly at the door. The world was shifting, economies were adjusting, metals were becoming more expensive, and governments were being forced to rethink even the most basic things, including something as ordinary as a 1-cent coin. The year was 1965. At first glance, the Canadian 1-cent coin of this year looks familiar. Queen Elizabeth II gazes outward, calm and composed, her portrait reflecting stability, continuity, and authority. To many, it was just another penny, something to be tossed into a pocket, dropped into a jar, or forgotten under a couch cushion. But for those who know what to look for, this coin represents far more than spare change. BY 1965, the Royal Canadian Mint was under pressure. Rising copper prices were creating serious concerns. Producing coins was becoming more expensive, and every decision carried financial consequences. That year became a turning point, a moment when old production methods collided with new economic realities. What most people never realized was that 1965 was not a simple, single-issue year for the Canadian cent. It was a year of transition, experimentation, and subtle differences that would later define rarity. Coins were struck under varying conditions with different metal compositions, different die preparations, and different levels of quality control. And that is where the story begins to change. Some of these coins were struck with extraordinary precision. Others were produced during rushed minting runs, when speed mattered more than perfection. Dies wore down, pressures varied. Small details shifted, often unnoticed at the time. But today, those differences are everything. Collectors who specialize in Canadian coinage know that the mid-1960s cents are a battlefield of fine details. The portrait of the Queen, the sharpness of the lettering, the spacing between letters, the depth of the strike, the texture of the fields. The tiniest variations can separate a common coin from a legendary one. And then there is condition. Most 1965 1-cent coins lived hard lives. They jingled in pockets. They scraped against keys. They slid across counters and through vending machines. They were exposed to moisture, oils, dirt, and neglect. Finding one today is easy. Finding one untouched by time is something else entirely. A pristine example from 1965 is not just rare. It is extraordinary. Now imagine a coin that somehow escaped circulation. A coin that never felt the rough edge of daily use. One that remained sealed away, protected from scratches, oxidation, and wear. Decades pass. The world changes. Pennies disappear from circulation. But this coin remains frozen in time. When such a piece surfaces, it doesn't whisper. It shocks. Advanced collectors understand that rarity is not only about mintage numbers. It is about survival. Tens of millions may have been struck, but how many remain in near-perfect condition today? How many still carry their original luster? How many show full detail in the Queen's hair, the delicate lines of her portrait, the crisp edges of the maple leaves on the reverse? Very few. And fewer still reach the highest grading levels. This is where seasoned collectors lean forward, because the difference between a nice coin and a historic one can be measured in microns. A single flaw, faint mark, a barely visible hairline scratch. These small imperfections determine whether a coin is worth a few dollars or becomes a centerpiece of an elite collection. The 1965 Canadian 1-cent coin has quietly become one of those pieces that separates casual collectors from serious ones. It represents a final breath of an era when copper still ruled small coinage, before economic pressure forced dramatic change. It is a coin born at the crossroads of tradition and necessity. There is also something deeply human about it. This coin circulated during a time when many of today's viewers were young men building careers, raising families, and shaping the lives they now look back on with pride. This penny bought coffee, newspapers, and bread. It rested in the hands of factory workers, farmers, shop owners, and soldiers returning home. It witnessed everyday life silently without recognition. And now, decades later, it demands recognition. What truly elevates the 1965 cent into another category is the combination of timing, condition, and collector demand. As younger collectors enter the market, nostalgia has become powerful. Coins from the 1960s are no longer old change. They are historical artifacts, physical connections to a world that no longer exists. Auction rooms have proven this shift. When a top-tier 1965 cent appears, attention intensifies. Bidding accelerates. What was once ignored becomes fiercely contested, because collectors know they may not see another example like it for years. And there is something else. Errors. The Royal Canadian Mint in 1965 was not immune to mistakes. Minor die variations, planchet anomalies, and striking irregularities have been documented by specialists. These errors, once dismissed as defects, are now considered treasures. They add another layer of intrigue to an already complex year. The right error, combined with the right condition, creates the perfect storm. To the untrained eye, it still looks like a penny. But to those who understand, it is a survivor, a witness, a quiet legend hiding in copper. This is why experienced collectors always say, never dismiss a coin until you truly know it. The most valuable pieces rarely announce themselves. They wait patiently for someone who understands their story. And now, as we reach the end of this chapter, the question becomes unavoidable. What is a 1965 Queen Elizabeth Canadian 1-cent coin truly worth today, when preserved at the highest level, when rarity, history, condition, and demand collide? At the very top of the market, when everything aligns, this coin has reached a value of $115,000. By the early 1970s, the world felt heavier. Confidence was being tested. Economies were tightening. Inflation was no longer a distant concept discussed by experts on television. It was something people felt every time they opened their wallets. Canada was no exception, and the year 1972 arrived carrying that weight quietly, pressed into copper. The 1-cent coin of 1972 entered circulation without ceremony.
No celebration. No fanfare.
It simply appeared, as pennies always had, small and familiar, slipping into daily life unnoticed. Yet this was a year when subtle decisions at the mint would ripple far into the future. Queen Elizabeth II still looked outward from the obverse, composed and unchanging, while the country around her was anything but. The early 70s marked a period of economic uncertainty, shifting trade relationships, and changing industrial priorities. Even the smallest denominations were affected by the pressure to balance cost, durability, and production speed. What many never realized is that 1972 was a year when consistency was difficult to maintain. Production volumes were high. Demand for circulating coinage remained strong. But increased speed often comes at a price. Dies were pushed harder. Quality control became a balancing act. The focus was on efficiency, not perfection. And when that happens, differences emerge. Some 1972 cents were struck cleanly, with strong detail and balanced pressure. Others came off the presses softer, with slightly weaker features, especially in the Queen's hair and facial contours. The reverse, with its maple leaves and delicate veins, often revealed the true story. Sharp definition separated exceptional pieces from ordinary ones. Time, once again, became the great filter. Most 1972 pennies lived exactly the life they were designed for. They circulated endlessly. They were used, spent, dropped, scraped, and forgotten. They aged alongside the people who carried them. By the time pennies began disappearing from everyday use, these coins were already worn down, dulled, and scarred. Finding a 1972 cent today is easy. Finding one that looks as if it were struck yesterday is not. Collectors know that coins from this era suffer from a particular challenge. Unlike much older coins, which people instinctively saved, 1970s coinage was viewed as disposable. Few thought to set aside pennies from their change. Fewer still preserved them carefully. As a result, high-grade survivors from 1972 are far scarcer than their original mintage numbers would suggest. Condition is everything here. A truly exceptional 1972 cent shows blazing original luster, smooth fields, and full strike detail. The Queen's portrait appears crisp, confident, and untouched by wear. The lettering stands sharp, without flattening or weakness. The reverse leaves look alive, each vein clearly defined, not blurred by circulation. When such a coin appears, it stops experienced collectors cold, because they understand what it represents. Not just rarity, but improbability. This coin survived a decade when almost nothing was saved. It escaped the hands of millions. It avoided damage, moisture, and careless storage. It remained protected while the world around it moved on. And that alone makes it special. But there is more. The 1972 cent also carries subtle varieties that reward careful study. Differences in strike strength, minute variations in die characteristics, and alignment details separate common examples from elite ones. These are not things casual collectors notice. They are the details that only emerge under magnification, studied by those who have spent years learning what normal looks like. When a coin deviates from normal in the right way, it becomes unforgettable. And then there are the stories tied to this era. For many men watching today, 1972 was a formative year. Careers were underway. Families were growing. Responsibilities were real. This penny moved through that world quietly. It paid for parking meters, newspapers, and cups of coffee. It sat in desk drawers, glove compartments, and cash registers. It was part of daily routine, not something meant to be admired. That connection matters. Because collecting is not just about metal. It is about memory. And the 1972 Canadian cent has become a bridge between past and present. A reminder that even the smallest objects can outlast the moments they served. As interest in Canadian coinage has grown, attention has shifted toward these overlooked years. Collectors now recognize that the 70s were not boring. They were transitional. They were messy. And they produced coins that tell honest stories about production pressure and economic change. When a top-tier 1972 cent appears at auction, it does not rely on hype. It relies on knowledge. Those who understand what they are seeing act decisively, because they know opportunities like this are rare. The bidding reflects that understanding. Quiet at first, then deliberate, then intense. Because once collectors realize what is on the table, hesitation disappears. And once again, we reach the inevitable question. What is a 1972 Queen Elizabeth Canadian 1-cent coin truly worth today, when preserved at the highest level, when survival against the odds meets growing demand? At the top end of the market, this coin has reached a value of $100,000. By the time 1981 arrived, the world felt faster. Technology was accelerating. Money was changing. The idea of value itself was beginning to shift in ways few fully understood. Canada, like many nations, was standing at the edge of a new era, and the 1-cent coin of that year quietly carried the weight of transition. At first glance, the 1981 Canadian cent appears ordinary. Queen Elizabeth II's portrait remains familiar, confident, unchanged. The reverse still carries the iconic maple leaves, a symbol so deeply embedded in national identity that it barely registers consciously anymore. This was the point. The penny was meant to feel stable, predictable, and unremarkable. But behind that familiarity, something important was happening. The early 1980s were marked by economic pressure. Inflation had reshaped spending habits. Manufacturing costs were under constant review. Governments everywhere were asking uncomfortable questions about whether small-denomination coins still made sense. The penny's future was no longer guaranteed. Even if few spoke openly about it. In 1981, the Royal Canadian Mint was focused on efficiency. Coins had to be produced quickly, economically, and in massive quantities. The cent was still needed, but it was no longer cherished. It was a tool, not a keepsake, and that mindset influenced everything. Quality once again became uneven. Many 1981 cents were struck with acceptable detail, good enough for circulation but not exceptional. Dyes were used extensively. Subtle softness appears on many surviving examples, especially in the Queen's hair and facial features. The maple leaves often show reduced definition, with veins less pronounced than in earlier decades. These are not flaws to the casual eye, but to collectors they are fingerprints of the era. Because when you find an exception, it stands apart immediately. A truly high-grade 1981 cent is something rare. Not because few were minted, but because few survived unscathed. The coin entered circulation at a time when people no longer thought twice about pennies. They were everywhere. They were ignored. They were treated as disposable. By this point, almost no one was setting aside rolls of cent coins with care. Storage conditions were poor. Coins were tossed into jars, boxes, and drawers without protection. Exposure to air and moisture dulled surfaces. Contact marks accumulated quickly. Time did the rest. Decades later, most 1981 cents show wear, discoloration, or surface damage. Even those that appear clean at first glance often reveal flaws under closer inspection. That is why top-condition examples are not just uncommon. They are elusive. And when one surfaces, it carries a sense of finality. Because the 1981 cent represents one of the last moments when the penny still felt permanent. Within a few decades, the idea of eliminating the 1-cent coin would move from speculation to reality. The cent would eventually disappear from daily use, leaving behind a long trail of forgotten change. This gives the 1981 issue a unique emotional weight. It belongs to a time when cash still ruled, when transactions were physical, and when value could be held in your hand. For many men watching today, this was the era of responsibility, of building something lasting, of measuring success not in numbers on a screen but in tangible progress. This coin was there for all of it. It sat in work boots, toolboxes, and jacket pockets. It crossed counters in diners, gas stations, and hardware stores. It became part of routine life, unnoticed but ever present. And yet, a small number of these coins avoided that fate. They were struck cleanly, with strong pressure and well-prepared dies. Their surfaces remained smooth. Their luster stayed intact. Their details stayed sharp. They did not suffer the abuse of circulation. They did not oxidize or corrode. They remained quietly, as they were made. Those coins are now the focus of intense attention, because collectors understand that the final years of widespread penny use hold a special kind of scarcity. Not official scarcity. Survival scarcity. The kind that only becomes visible decades later, when the common has vanished and only the exceptional remains. When an elite 1981 cent appears, it attracts collectors who recognize that this is not just a high-grade coin. It is a time capsule, a preserved moment from the last chapter of an era. The bidding reflects that understanding. It is not rushed. It is deliberate. Collectors know what they are competing for, and they know how rarely such opportunities arise. Once again, the smallest details make the biggest difference. A flawless field, a sharp strike, a complete absence of wear. These are the qualities that transform a forgotten penny into a historic artifact. And so we arrive at the final question. What is a 1981 Queen Elizabeth Canadian 1-cent coin truly worth today, when preserved at the highest level, when condition, timing, and rarity converge at the end of the penny's story? At the top of the market, this coin has reached a value of $90,000.